Let's talk about picture profiles and which one to use for the kind of shots that you want to get. In this video, we'll talk about the different options that are available in picture profiles and which ones you'd want to use in which kind of situation. So let's get into it. Now, with most cameras, there are a bunch of preset picture profiles. I wouldn't recommend that you use these because, like I say with everything else, you should be able to know your settings well enough to be able to manually control and adjust how you want your images to look in different situations. Because to be honest, there isn't one picture profile that would look best for every situation, and I would use different picture profiles for different situations. So I'm going to walk you through the different options of what you can adjust in your picture profile settings, and then talk to you about what situations you'd use different settings for. So if you go ahead and open up your picture profile settings, you can see that there are different presets and then a few slots for creating your own picture profile settings. If you click the info button, there are settings for sharpness, contrast, saturation, and color tone, which you can adjust to create your own picture profiles. We're going to talk about each one of these and show how they affect your image. First on the list is sharpness. This adds digital sharpening, which in my opinion doesn't look that great. So I would recommend creating a picture profile with sharpness turned all the way down. If your image is too soft, you can always add sharpening in editing, but you can't take it away. Here's what a video looks like with sharpness turned all the way down versus a video with sharpness turned all the way up. So no matter what, I would always turn sharpness all the way down. Next up is contrast. This one will depend on what shooting situation you're in and also how much dynamic range you want captured in your image. Dynamic range shows how much detail is captured in your shadows and in your highlights. And if the contrast is turned all the way up, your blacks will be crushed and your highlights will be blown out. So here's an example of a clip with the contrast turned all the way down versus a clip with the contrast turned all the way up. As you can see, with the contrast turned all the way down, there's much more detail in the shadows and in the highlights, but it doesn't necessarily look cinematic. Now that's okay because you can always add contrast back in editing. So I would recommend shooting with your contrast turned down just a little bit, like 1 or 2 notches. And then if you're in a situation where there's already a lot of contrast happening naturally, like for example, shooting someone on a stage with a bright spotlight hitting them, or shooting something where there's a lot of harsh shadows, I would turn the contrast all the way down so that you can capture as much detail in the shadows as well as the highlights. Next up is saturation. This shows how saturated your colors are. Here's an example of a video with saturation turned all the way down versus turned all the way up. For this one, I usually keep my saturation right in the middle at 0. And if you want to add or take away saturation, you can always do so in editing. And finally, color tone shows how much green or magenta is in your image. Here's a video with color tone turned all the way to the left and a video with color tone turned all the way to the right. I would also keep this one at 0, and if you need to, you can adjust this in editing as well. Now, there are some cameras out there that allow you to shoot in log, which is the flattest picture profile, which also has pros and cons. The pros to shooting in log is that you can maximize how much dynamic range you're shooting and capture as much detail in the shadows and in the highlights as you can, but the cons of shooting in log is that it doesn't show what your image will end up looking like, which makes it a bit harder for adjusting white balance and exposure and keeping your image in focus while shooting. Log can also make it so that your image falls apart when you add a heavy color grade to it, so I definitely would not shoot in log unless your camera can shoot in at least 10-bit color depth. A higher color depth gives you more color information and allows you to adjust and manipulate your colors in editing without having your image fall apart like this. So that's it for this video. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.